Imagine sitting down to two dinners that look exactly the same vegetables, the same source of protein, and the same serving of rice. Nothing has been removed, and nothing has been replaced with a special diabetic food. Yet one small detail may influence what happens after the meal: the order in which those foods are eaten. Research on meal sequencing suggests that beginning with non-starchy vegetables, moving to protein or legumes, and leaving carbohydrate-rich foods such as rice until later may help reduce or slow the rise in blood glucose compared with eating the carbohydrate first. The idea is not that the carbohydrate somehow disappears. Your body still has to process what you ate. Instead, fiber, protein, and the mixed meal may influence digestion and how quickly glucose reaches the bloodstream. But this distinction is essential. Changing food order is not a cure for type 2 diabetes, nor can it rescue an unbalanced meal. Think of it as one potentially useful tool within a much larger picture. And that raises a more interesting question. Why should eating the exact same foods in a different sequence change the body's response at all? That brings us to the purpose of meal sequencing. It does not make carbohydrates disappear. It may change how quickly glucose from a meal reaches the bloodstream. If rice, bread, potatoes, or pasta are on your plate, your body still digests them. Eating vegetables first does not reduce their carbohydrate content. What changes is the conditions in which those foods arrive. Fiber-rich vegetables, followed by protein or legumes, may slow digestion and support a more gradual post-meal glucose response. This may matter with insulin resistance, whose cells respond less effectively to insulin. Limits matter. Food order cannot cancel an oversized meal, erase carbohydrates, or replace medication and medical care. It is a practical strategy that may influence the speed of glucose delivery. Once that distinction is clear, a new question appears. Why can the same carbohydrate produce a different response depending on what reaches the stomach first? This is where the glycemic index, or GI, needs some context. GI is useful, but it does not perfectly predict what will happen after a real mixed meal. The value is measured under standardized conditions using a set amount of available carbohydrate from a test food, usually eaten without the other foods on your dinner plate. Real life looks different. Rice may be eaten with vegetables, beans, fish, or other foods, and the combination can influence digestion and the glucose response. Meal order may add another layer, so a high or low GI number should not be treated as a guaranteed forecast of what your glucose meter will show after dinner. Responses can vary with portion size, meal composition, medications, activity, and other factors. GI can still be a useful guide, but it is only one piece of the puzzle. Once that distinction is clear, a deeper question emerges. Why does insulin resistance make the speed of glucose entering the bloodstream so important? To understand why meal order has limits, it helps to look beyond the plate and at insulin resistance itself. Think of insulin as a signal that helps glucose move from the bloodstream into cells where it can be used for energy. With insulin resistance, those cells respond less effectively to that signal. So managing blood glucose involves far more than deciding which food enters the stomach first. Eating vegetables before protein or legumes and leaving starch until later may influence the post-meal glucose response, but it does not correct insulin resistance on its own. The bigger picture can include the diet quality, physical activity, weight management when appropriate, and medical treatment tailored to the individual. Meal sequencing should be viewed as a supporting habit, not a cure or replacement for care. That distinction matters because the next question is not simply what works, but how strong the evidence behind each claim is. This is where scientific evidence must be handled carefully because not every study answers the same question. The source describes a 2006 trial involving people with type 2 diabetes that examined a dietary pattern and changes in A1C. It also discusses a separate 2020 study involving overweight adults without diabetes, which investigated changes including fat stored in the liver and muscle. These findings should never be blended into one claim. Most importantly, the 2020 study did not measure A1C, so it cannot be used as evidence that this intervention lowered A1C in those participants. Neither study should automatically be presented as direct proof that meal sequencing itself produces the same long-term effects. Research specifically examining food order is a separate evidence base with its own limitations. Keeping those questions apart may sound cautious, but it protects us from turning an interesting strategy into a promise science has not established. So what might this look like at an ordinary meal? A practical starting point is to eat non-starchy vegetables first. Broccoli, green beans, cabbage, spinach, peppers, or cauliflower can become the opening part of the meal rather than something left on the plate until the end. The reasoning centers largely on fiber. Fiber-rich foods can influence digestion, and some types of fiber may help slow how quickly nutrients move through the digestive process. That may help create a more gradual environment before carbohydrate-rich foods arrive. But this is where precision matters. There is no need to turn the idea into a rigid rule about an exact fraction of the plate, or promise that a specific fiber target will produce a particular glucose result. Individual needs vary, and meal order is only one factor. The useful principle is simpler. Begin with a meaningful serving of non-starchy vegetables when appropriate. Then comes the next question. What should follow the vegetables before the starch arrives? Once the vegetables have started the meal, the next step is to move toward legumes or another protein source before reaching for the starch. Lentils, chickpeas, black beans, kidney beans, tofu, and tempeh are examples that can fit naturally into this part of the meal. Legumes are especially interesting because they provide both protein and fiber, creating a different digestive setting before carbohydrate-rich foods arrive. This does not mean protein creates a protective shield or prevents carbohydrates from being absorbed. The starch still counts, and portion size still matters. Instead, the practical idea is to build the meal in stages. Non-starchy vegetables first, legumes or protein next, and the more carbohydrate-rich food afterward. It is a simple sequence rather than a treatment, and individual glucose responses can differ. But now we reach the part many people find hardest to imagine. If rice or bread is still allowed, why deliberately save it for last? Saving starch for last does not mean carbohydrates suddenly become the enemy. Rice, bread, potatoes, pasta, or tortillas can still be part of a balanced meal when they fit a person's nutritional needs. The idea is simply to eat them after non-starchy vegetables and protein or legumes, rather than automatically starting the meal with them. By that point, other foods are already being digested, which may influence how quickly glucose from the carbohydrate enters the bloodstream and help moderate the post-meal response in some people. But there is an important limit. Meal order cannot compensate for an oversized portion or transform a meal dominated by refined carbohydrates into a balanced one. The amount and overall quality of the meal still matter. So the goal is not to fear or ban carbohydrates, but to think about both quantity and sequence. Yet one common habit can undermine that sequence before dinner even begins: what we eat or drink while waiting for the meal. But meal sequencing can begin before the first bite of dinner. A glass of orange juice, sweetened coffee, crackers, or bread eaten while waiting may put fast-digesting carbohydrates at the front of the meal, the opposite of the sequence we have been building. That does not make these foods automatically forbidden, but timing matters when the goal is a more gradual post-meal glucose response. A practical approach is to choose water or another unsweetened drink before eating, and, when carbohydrate-rich foods are included, have them later, rather than automatically starting with them. Eating at a slower, comfortable pace may also help separate the stages of the meal. But there is no scientifically established stopwatch rule saying everyone must take exactly 20 minutes. The useful lesson is not to chase a magic number. It is to eat deliberately, give the meal some time, and remember that individual responses vary. And that leads to the final question: how much can this strategy actually do? That brings us to the most important limit of this entire strategy. Meal order is a tool, not a treatment by itself. Two people can eat the same vegetables, protein, and rice in the same sequence and still see different glucose responses. Insulin sensitivity, portion size, physical activity, medications, sleep, and other individual factors can all influence what happens after a meal. That is why your own glucose readings, interpreted within your care plan, matter more than any promise made in a video. This is especially important for people using insulin or other glucose-lowering medications. Significant dietary changes can alter glucose patterns and may increase the risk of blood sugar falling too low in some people. Keep monitoring as recommended and discuss meaningful changes with your healthcare professional. Never reduce or stop prescribed medication based on this strategy alone. The takeaway is simple. Vegetables first, protein or legumes next, starch later, but always within a balanced diet and an appropriate medical plan.